Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Course 11 of the Monique and Roland Weil People's Academy of International Law. I am Marjorie Cohn, Dean of the People's Academy and a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. Our topic for today is international law and the crisis of the world capitalist system. Our distinguished faculty for this course is Bijou Matthew, Bernard Anwomo Doji Bokojin, and Walden Bello. Each of them will speak for 35 or 40 minutes. They will then comment on each other's presentations, followed by questions and answers with all of you. We have French, Spanish, and English translation. You can select your language at the bottom of your screen with a little globe. Please put your questions in the Q&A box for our discussion. In the next few days, we will post on our website, peoplesacademy.net, the faculty presentations in English, French, and Spanish, along with written presentations and outlines and links to relevant articles. You will receive an email when the program is posted. This course will explore how we can use international law, including human rights and environmental law, to resist the oppression of the world capitalist system in this current phase of neoliberalism. We will look at creative strategies to mitigate and oppose the policies and practices of the public, financial, and trade system of the Bretton Woods institutions, which prop up the capitalist order. Practitioners from the global South who advocate a new international economic order and who represent those involved in resisting debt will discuss their advocacy and litigation and explain the doctrine of odious debt. Another key focus will be on international labor rights, on the law and institutions centering on the International Labor Organization, and the role of labor unions in resisting austerity and advancing labor rights, including the right to strike and the ALO case on the right to strike. Dr. Bijou Matthew is a scholar, writer, and organizer whose work spans labor rights, migration, and transnational politics. Based in New York, he teaches at Rider University, where his research examines the intersections of neoliberalism, diaspora, and Hindu nationalism. He is the author of Taxi, Cabs and Capitalism in New York City, published in 2005, which is a landmark ethnography of immigrant labor organizing that traces the political economy of South Asian taxi drivers in the city. Beyond academia, Bijou is a co-founder of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, a long-standing advocate for workers and minority rights, as well as the founding executive director of Indian Civil Watch International, an anti-fascist collective. Through his scholarship and public engagement, he has become an influential voice, linking critical theory with movements for economic and social justice. Bijou will address many crises, but no end to capitalism, contours of a new labor strategy. Bernard Anwomo Doji Bokojin holds a master's degree in political sociology and communication from the University of Lomé in Togo. A key figure in Togolese and African civil society for over a decade, He is currently the coordinator of the association New Alternatives for Sustainable Development in Africa, or NADAF. He works on issues of corporate responsibility, disaster risk reduction, food sovereignty, and sustainable consumption patterns, as well as civic participation and youth political engagement. He is an expert on transitional justice and a member of the African Union team on addressing the past. Bernard's publications include Dealing with the Past for Lasting Reconciliation, Reparation, and Transitional Justice, published by European University Press in 2023. Memory Notebooks number 001 and number 002, a series of digital publications on transitional justice in Togo with a special focus on memory reparations. And his contribution, Transitional Justice in the African Context, the Cases of Togo and Mali, in the collection Post-Conflict, A Cross-Cutting Approach, Justice, Institutions, and Media, published by Francophone Institute for Justice and Democracy. Bernard will discuss Debt is a Mechanism of Neocolonialism and Domination by Great Powers through the Bretton Woods institutions. Walden Bello is currently co-chair of the board of the Bangkok-based Research and Advocacy Institute Focus on the Global South, an associate of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, and a retired professor at both the University of the Philippines and the State University of New York at Binghamton. A recipient of the 2003 Right Livelihood Award, also known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. He is the author of 26 books, the latest of which is Global Battlefields, Memoir of a Legendary Public Intellectual from the Global South, which was published this year. In 2008, he was named Outstanding Public Scholar of the International Studies Association. Walden will address deglobalization and its challenges. So our first presenter will be Bijou. Bijou, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marjorie. Can you guys hear me? Just want to confirm. Hi, everybody. Good to be here and in the company of such distinguished people as Bernard and Walden and Marjorie and the rest of the team, as also all the students who I know that the audience here for this course is a tremendous kind of a cross-section of folks from across the world who are themselves involved in all sorts of fascinating battles around the global capitalist system. So I'm really honored to be here. And I just want to say that I will, for just for the ease of presentation, I will actually go off camera because I have a vision problem as a result of it. Staring at a screen is difficult. So I will, for the rest of my presentation, go off camera and speak. I hope that's okay. All right. The last 50 years, if we date the onset of the neoliberal period as emerged somewhere in the 1970s, and over the last 50 years, the neoliberal economic system has consolidated across the world, and in a sense, what we have today is a period, we're going through a period wherein 50 years of neoliberalism has produced its own crisis within the global capitalist system. As is expected, capitalism as a system is unstable in the longue durée, and every resolution it makes of a crisis sets it up for the production of the next crisis, even if that takes a decade to unfold, 2 decades to unfold, etc. So what we have is, from the mid-70s, from 1975, if we take the time period 1975 to 2025 as 50 years of neoliberalism, I would begin by characterizing this period in a very simple structure of 2 phases of neoliberalism. From 1975 up to the mid-90s or even the early 2000s, I would say is the period when the capitalist class, through the enactment of neoliberal policy, seeks to take control of the global economy once again, after having lost some control over it, or at least ended up in a negotiated space through the period of the Keynesian Compact. From the time of the Great Depression all the way into the 70s, there is a period of negotiated sharing of productivity gains between the capitalist class and some section of global workers, at least in the West. And this period is a period where the capitalist class is brought under some discipline, so to speak, of not just national governments, which varies, but also of an international system of governance, as we can understand, as something that was created during that period through the UN structure, and in the case of particular relation between labor and capital, the ILO itself, and all such formations. So you have in the from the mid-70s onwards, as capital, at least in its claimed form in the mid-70s, claims a crisis of profitability, claims that capitalism itself is becoming unsustainable under conditions of that shared, negotiated, quote-unquote, peace between labor and capital through the Keynesian Compact, and breaks out most visibly, let's say, for purposes, there are many, many signs across the world, but for purposes of just putting a few flags down, the emergence of Reagan in the United States, the emergence of Thatcher in the UK, the series of coups that mark the quote-unquote global South, everything from Chile to Bangladesh. If you think about that entire stretch, it's the moment when the capitalist class is trying to take control once again of the global economy and reset the rules once again under conditions of a post-war settlement, not under conditions of a post-war settlement where they feel, the capitalist class once again feels that they're experiencing a crisis of profitability and therefore need to break out. The first phase, therefore, from 1975 all the way till about the late 90s, early 2000s, is a period when they are restructuring the global economy into something new, into the neoliberal formation frame, where you're destroying the welfare structures, you're destroying labor rights, you're trying to undermine all of that, and you are simultaneously advancing new structures of capital formation. This is the period, and this is a period wherein you see, a number of deregulatory practices emerging all across the world. And by the late 90s, early 2000s, you are now beginning to see capital once again emerge with super profits and with a particular kind of new hegemony. I'm saying this to mark also a certain difference in the sense that if we treat the neoliberal period from 1975 all the way to the current date as one single thing, where finance capital begins to dominate, and we understand it through the Bretton Woods system and the Bretton Woods institutions being the main player, then we might miss some of the nuances and some of the more emergent structures that are at play, some of the new power brokers that are at play. The Bretton Woods institutions, whether it's the IMF and the World Bank, and the space that it yields to the World Trade Organization by the late 90s, early 2000s, if you think about those as the battering ram, the advance party, the initial edge of the sword that cuts through or destroys the Keynesian compact and sets up the conditions for a neoliberal hegemony, then you should also think about what grew during this period. And I'm sure this will connect to the next lecture when Bernard presents on debt. But essentially, if you look at the late 60s, early 70s, and look at the world of finance capital, it's dominated by regular banking institutions and a distinction between consumer banking, merchant banking, and all of that. But things like venture capital, private equity, all of these are almost non-existent. They're tiny, tiny parts of the global financial situation, infrastructure. But by the early 2000s, by the time the e-commerce boom and bust happens, starting about 1998, when suddenly the internet having been privatized, there's this tremendous boost to the entry of private capital into a new space to colonize called the internet. And you see that, and you watch that unfold. And by the early 2000s, you can see that private equity capital, venture capital, and these formations have really grown into this humongous monolith, this behemoth, that today sets the stage for how capital is run and how capital responds to everything that happens in the world. So I'm pointing, for instance, to the fact that we need to think about things like private equity capital and the formations around places like Silicon Valley and very many other tech hubs across the world, etc., as a new formation, hegemonic formation from within capital itself. And I'll tell you why that's important, because when we talk about crises and contradictions, we'll understand why that new formation is so important. All of this by way of context. The period that we see, therefore, immediately after the dot-com crisis and the boom and the bust cycle there, the period starting the late 90s, early 2000s, what I'm calling phase two of the neoliberal economy, is one that is characterized by some very interesting contradictions, both produced sometimes entirely within the framework of capital, and some that are produced significantly inside the framework of capital, but also through broader processes that might even have a longer history than capitalism itself. I'm going to refer to three different contradictions here as the key contradictions that frame our moment. And I'm going to be fairly quick about it because I also want to then go and then describe some of the work that I have done as a labor organizer over the last 25, 30 years and connect that to the story. And only then come to the final analysis of where I'm presenting what labor needs to do now, how to do it, how to think about it, and all of that. So in other words, I've just given you a little bit of a, instead of a standard understanding of neoliberalism as something that opens the 1970s and is still continuing as a particular formation of hegemony of capital, I have broken up neoliberalism itself into a two-phase process. One is from the mid-70s into the late 90s, and the other from there to the current moment. The second phase being the true period of a neoliberal capitalist hegemony with new institutional frameworks and new social forces from within the capitalist class that are playing a different role. So that's the setup. That's kind of the broad introduction. Now we're going to go into three sections. Section one is I'm going to talk about three crises or three contradictions as they're emergent, then go into a little bit of my work, and from there bring those two together into where we go into the future. The three contradictions. First, capital for the last 20 years. Here's a hypothesis. I'm not going to claim that any of this is globally true in the sense that I am 100% sure. I am a scholar, I'm an intellectual, I'm an activist, I'm an organizer, just like many of you. And therefore, when I present something, I expect that it's something I'm presenting for the purpose of engagement, something where I will gain as much as anybody else, all of you. So the first crisis I want to talk about, the first contradiction I want to talk about is that for the last 25 years, capitalism is going through what one can call a crisis of overaccumulation. That is the first 20 years, the first phase one of the neoliberal period, where capital reasserted hegemony, control, and destroyed almost all of the structures, both in the first world and the global south, where some of the gains of productivity gains were shared between multiple segments of society, when capital tore all of that down and started accumulating greater and greater portions of surplus for itself. And by the late 90s, it has reached this point wherein it has an enormous, a giant pool of capital, one might call it, sloshing around the world, trying to find spaces of investment. And the global economy is in a place wherein all of that capital, it's no longer easy with the levels of accumulation that the previous 2 decades or even the 3 decades up to about, I would say, 2003, 2004 had seen. The 3 decades, the level of accumulation you had begun to see, that giant pool of capital does not have an adequate set of places to invest. It's in that sense a crisis of accumulation, overaccumulation. And that, if you really just think about it that way, that's the only condition under which you can really explain the 2008 financial crisis, wherein there's a kind of a reckless dumping of capital. So that's, and then, it's like this is where private equity capital, venture capital structures come in, because they have a very different rule in terms of how of their rules of investment. They are no longer interested in, let's say, assessing risk of every project and having a risk portfolio that is kind of, a very narrow band, right? The venture capital rule of risk is you have, let's say, 50 projects that a particular venture capital is investing in. And it could go from, very wide range of risks, because in the end, they don't care about the success of all 50 projects or even a majority of those projects. All they need is one or two of those projects to succeed for them to get an ROI on the entire portfolio, right? So it's a very different set of rules of investment. And therefore, debt, etc., begins to take on new meaning here under these conditions. So that's the first contradiction. That is, and capital is still, that because profitability is still very high, because there's a way in which private equity capital drives certain ideas of what profit itself is and accumulation is by driving stock markets and other public infrastructure, financial infrastructure, in ways that it does in a globally connected world. It's this giant pool of capital that is sloshing around, as I call it, is still in that state of ferment, wherein it's really trying to find spaces of investment on a constant basis, creating bubbles, and it's like what Harvey at one point, David Harvey, one of the preeminent theorists of neoliberalism, begins to call, it's searching for almost anything to invest in. So you see spectacles, right? Like one of the examples that I think he uses is the opening ceremonies of Olympics and World Cups, etc. It goes from being these small affairs to these spectacles wherein you burn up enormous amounts of capital in half an hour or 1 hour, right? And you're trying to get eyeballs to watch advertising, etc., as a way to kind of recover surplus from those spaces, right? So it's all the rules are changing in that sense, and it's producing institutions or monsters like Amazon, like Uber, like Facebook, like all of the oligarchy at this point. One of the fundamental changes in the rules of capital is that capital is under conditions of venture capital hegemony is no longer myopic in the old sense of the word that capital is always myopic. It's seeking profit in a very short time frame. It's seeking to turn things around in a matter of, let's say a few years, right? No, I mean, if you look at Amazon, it takes losses for almost a little more than a decade. If you take something like Uber, it takes losses, tremendous losses, huge losses for literally over a decade, right? So it's a particular kind of change of game also that's happening in there. So that's one contradiction that I want to point out to, and that's one contradiction that you can see that when you have I'm sorry, when you have I'm very sorry, there's somebody just walked into the room. You can see that when you have something like the venture capital changing the rules of investment, etc., in this particular way, you can see that you can even connect it to some new political formations. Like, for instance, I'm in New York, and we have just had the Mamdani victory, and you can see that the centrality of taxing the rich, taxing the billionaire class, of doing things to kind of bring the wealth gap down, etc. The kind of cadence that's got, the kind of new spirit behind those movements that you're beginning to see emerge all across the world, right? It's precisely this. It's precisely the impact of this kind of hegemony in phase two of neoliberal capital, especially venture capital, especially the kind of profit structures that it's seeking, etc. So that's one contradiction that will necessarily have to be resolved. I mean, and I'm assuming here that everybody here has a sense of this notion of contradiction that I'm using. Maybe not. Maybe I'll do a kind of my quick and dirty version of explaining what I mean by a contradiction in the Marxist sense of the word. I mean, I can't go into a very detailed lecture about it here, but let's put it this way. If we think about the globe, the world that we live on, Earth as we understand it, we understand, we never see it. We can't, we are unable to appreciate it in terms of physically understanding it, but we know that there are tectonic plates that underlie the Earth, and that they are grinding up against each other and being held in place, not because they are in the stable state, but as they grind up against each other, they are stuck against each other. They are pushing against each other with tremendous force and are holding a stable world, because those two, three tremendous forces of multiple tectonic plates pushing against each other is giving us an appearance of a stable world that we stand on, Earth that we stand on. And then something happens, there's a slight shift, and one of the tectonic plates shifts a little bit, and we have an earthquake, right? And at the end of the earthquake, it's back there, stuck stuck with all the forces pushing against each other. That is a way in which we can understand the notion of capitalism, that a contradiction in capitalism, wherein different social forces are pushing up against each other. The capitalist class, the workers, they're pushing up against each other, and different economies are held up in place as a resolution for a particular period of time, but it cracks, and then you need to come to a new resolution. It's not 100% complete resolution of the contradiction, but every contradiction goes through partial resolutions, new stabilizations that last for a brief period, and then is back to being reworked again. So that is one way of thinking about the notion of contradiction. And here we have this crisis of overaccumulation, which is the contradiction wherein capitalists seeking profit in a particular way, etc., and that's producing this wealth gap, all of this as a necessary consequence of that. And that's a contradiction that we will resolve in one way or another, in favor of capital, in favor of the working class, in favor of some middle ground there. We don't know, but that's one contradiction that we know will reach a new resolution somewhere in the next decade. Somewhere in the next 10, 15 years, we'll see some tremendous shakeups happening in that space. The second crisis and the second contradiction that I want to point to, which I know the least about and therefore will keep my comments to a minimum, is, of course, the crisis of climate change, of ecology, of environment, etc. It's, of course, to a huge degree, a significant degree, produced out of the capitalist production system that underlies the current crisis, but it's also a much longer phenomena, that is connected to beyond capital, also other forces in terms of our understanding of science, how we treated the physical world around us for centuries, etc. Right? And so that contradiction, which is also will need some will head for various kinds of resolutions in the next 2 decades, in the next 2 or 3 decades, we'll see certain new kind of resolutions of that contradiction. For me, in my work, apart from the transportation systems that I'm involved in and the expression of this contradiction within that space, through whether it is the demand that all taxis in New York City, whether it's Uber or Lyft or yellow taxis or green taxis, that all of them become EV vehicles in the next 5 years, 10 years, whether it's expressions of that sort, and therefore the question of what do we do with workers' rights during that period, how do we deal with that, whether it is expressions at that level, or with my other hat on when I'm looking at the world, for instance, structured through in something like India Civil Watch International, when you think about the coal-based production all across the world, how we there's a tremendous push in terms of the ecological contradiction to end fossil fuels, to move away from coal, but at the same time you have economies like India that are still deeply invested in coal, and oligarchs like Gautam Adani, etc., who are the greatest, kind of the biggest producers of coal, the coal economy all across the world, etc., then you have a particular involvement that I have with that contradiction. But it is also the contradiction that, at least while I understand that it exists as a contradiction, that I myself have the least knowledge on, but I include within the frame of how I see the global system reaching new resolutions. Because this contradiction will also necessarily have to get resolved. The third contradiction, and it's not a contradiction at the same level as global capital as a formation, and therefore the crisis produced by overaccumulation, or the climate change ecology contradiction. But at a different scale, capital attempts to turn everything that it touches into a commodity. And there is a particular contradiction that's produced there because it seeks to colonize a whole range of things that were previously understood to be part of the commons. It's a cultural understanding of what belongs to all of us. That is getting colonized by capital in its desperate urge to create new spaces of value for itself. So, I mean, things like carbon credits at one end is a particular manifestation of it. That is, air itself becomes a particular kind of commodity in that frame. Water will become a commodity in that frame, right? But beyond all that, things like knowledge, information, data, right? All of these become spaces of a new contradiction, which is capital seeks to enter these spaces and colonize them and take them over really rapidly. And people are left far behind because their sense of these spaces as common property, as something that belongs to humanity, as belongs to people, is a culturally produced one. And culture is not enacted through rules in the sense of laws, and therefore it's left wide open for capital to come in and colonize. And people's pushback against it, resistance to it, first emerges primarily as cultural resistance, and then has to transform into new institutions of law, new institutions of rules and regulations and regulatory frameworks, etc. And it's a struggle to claw your way back after capital has colonized a certain space and pull it back out. So, for instance, the question becomes, under conditions of things like artificial intelligence emerging and all of these technologies emerging, there is a claim to tremendous productivity growth in that space. And that itself needs to be evaluated. But who gains from that, those gains in productivity? That becomes it becomes a really big question, right? And it is fundamentally unresolved. At this moment, it's leaning in the direction of being resolved in favor of capital, as capital has come and just grabbed it, right? I mean, my favorite example is all across the world now, especially in the quote-unquote global north, in the first world, there's talk about the autonomous car, the self-driving car, right? It's something that worries me on a daily basis, because what's going to happen to all the workers? What's going to happen to all the drivers who are driving cars right now, right? So, but if you think about how an autonomous car is produced, and here's a simple hypothesis which I keep at the center of understanding this contradiction, which is that if there was something that human beings were collectively doing for the last many, many, many decades, for centuries, and if that work gets absorbed into a piece of automation, such as in this case, a self-driving car, then the hypothesis is as follows: that there was publicly available knowledge or implicit knowledge that is trapped in big, humongous data sets, that capital has grabbed and appropriated a kind of a primitive accumulation process wherein it's taken this over and it's secured it for itself. What Harvey then calls I'm forgetting Harvey's formulation of it. Dispossession, accumulation by dispossession, right? Grabs it, secures it, puts a fence around it, makes it theirs, and then begins to draw value from it. This value actually belongs to the common space, but they have appropriated it. So the self-driving car can only emerge because of that, because of the driving records of millions and millions of people on an urban space, let's say like New York, every day for 24 hours in a day. All this data is appropriated to then produce a self-driving car. And the value of all of that knowledge implicit in that data is not granted back to society, right? So that's a third space that we have to think about in terms of that contradiction, which is currently being resolved in the direction of capital. But you can clearly see there's a whole bunch of people wanting to rethink that space. How do you claw back? How do you fight your way back into the center of this and say that belongs to us, etc.? Having outlined these three, I mean, I've obviously what I've done here is kind of, as I reach the third contradiction, I've kind of begun to open up the space of my own work. My work is on two domains, two areas. One is my work as a labor organizer that I've done for the past almost 3 decades, starting out in the late 90s, 1997, 1998, when I was one of the co-founders of the Taxi Workers Alliance here in New York City, and simultaneously over the last 2 decades or more, responding to the growth of a particular kind of new form of fascism in India under the Hindu supremacist movement. If these have been two primary areas of work, I'm going to focus a lot more on the first today, but that's not to leave out the second, but just because I won't have time to go into both in great detail. So I started out being a labor organizer in the world of taxis back when there were just regular yellow taxis in the streets of New York, or the Kali Pili, the black and yellow taxis on the streets of Bombay, or the black car in London. This is an industry that has emerged as the motorized taxi industry emerges in the early 1900s. In New York, the first motorized taxi was a French car, I think. It was a Peugeot car that is the first taxi deployed on the streets of New York with gasoline-powered car. It's in 1908, 1907. London is 1908. Bombay is 1911. Cairo, it's 1912. So it's this period where all of the taxi industry emerges. And the taxi goes through many different pieces of reform. But, it goes through a period of what's called commission employment, wherein drivers are treated as employees, but on commission, right? Wherein this is during the period of the Keynesian Compact, reflecting the power of that compact, reflecting the power of that negotiated settlement between capital and labor. Taxi drivers who were earlier treated as a kind of self-employed independent contractor are reclassified in significant parts of the world as employees, as people who are working for something called commission employment, wherein there are collective bargaining contracts that are in place, where, let's say, a garage in New York City and the 200 drivers who drive in that garage have a collective bargaining agreement with a union in place, where the union, the drivers are taking, let's say, 55% of all fares, and the garage owner, the capital, is taking 45% of all fares collected in a 24-hour period. Let's say bargaining agreements like that, but you're treated as an employee where all the expenses belong to the company, etc., etc. And then in terms of, this is what I cover in my book, like the 1970s, this compact is broken and the neoliberal agenda enters, wherein leasing is brought in, wherein a driver walks into a garage, drops $100 on the table, takes a car out, and the boss doesn't care whether you pick up 10 fares, 5 fares, 25 fares, or no fares, because the boss has already got the $100, and that's leasing. And you can turn the corner, you come out of the fleet garage, you can turn the corner, park your car, and go to sleep, and the boss doesn't care. That's leasing, where all the risk of earning, there's no splitting of the meter. There's an upfront payment, and it's a lease payment, and that's done, right? So that new system, which is the neoliberal system, emerges way back in the 70s in the taxi industry. I always say that the taxi drivers, the cannery, and the coal mines, every experiment is first done on them, right? And then the new formations begin to emerge. So that neoliberal structure of leasing goes all the way from the 1970s into the into the 2000s, where for about 30 years, that's the structure. Then in 2010, 2011, a new force emerges, which is backed by venture capital, things like Uber, Lyft in the United States, things like Bolt and other formations across Europe, things like Didi and Didi and Careem and Grab in Asia. So these formations emerge, and they're all backed by humongous amounts of venture capital, this giant pool of capital that's sloshing around, right? That's who is investing in this. And they have this thing of stretching out for 10 years, 15 years before an IPO can happen, and then they grab their profits and they run, right? So that's the structure. And in this 1 decade or a little more, the entire 100-year history of the taxi industry unfolds in a telescoped way in the Uber, Lyft, Bolt, Didi, Ola frame, right? Because what you have is you start out, it's unregulated. They claim, that's why the name rideshare, as if it's one guy in a private car who has a good intention and is just dropping another person off who's going in the same direction, before it turns into this industry that is run through an app. And then there's, as workers begin to push back, you settle for a new structure of commission employment, so to speak, wherein, of course, the company is resisting any classification of those workers as employees, but commission emerges as a structure of payment, where Uber is like, oh, we don't take more than 20% commission on any fare, but we know they're charging 30, we know they're charging sometimes 50% commission, right? But that's okay, that's a different matter. But commission structures emerge, and that goes on for a stretch. And now, for instance, you're beginning to see in spaces like India, the emergence of something called a subscription model, wherein suddenly you're back to leasing, wherein no longer does a driver make their money by taking 70% or 80% of every fare, but the driver now pays upfront to subscribe to an app, and the app opens for a limited period of time as per your subscription level, and you can collect fares from the street, right? So that's a new model that's emerging in India right now, et cetera, right? So that's that's the industry I organize in. That's the industry that I've organized in for the last almost 3 decades. And what we are seeing there is that the labor movement as a whole, even after 30 years, is unable to fully appreciate that this is how capital has organized and reorganized that industry. What's at play here is this is almost like every union is doing its own thing within the space. Most clearly, for instance, I'll give you 2 examples. When you analyze this from the point of view of capital and you really think about it, then you know that your gold standard is the structure of employment that was worked out in that Keynesian compact. That's the most practical and concrete gold standard that you have ever found for yourself. I'm not saying it's some ideal type, but it is it's the best resolution you've found in a practical way over the last century, right? This idea called employment and this idea called, every worker being employed and every productivity gain being shared between worker and capital, the working class and capital. That's a particular resolution. It's not a revolutionary resolution, but it's a particular resolution within the framework of capitalism, right? That itself is not understood by a majority of the unions at this point. Majority of the unions, over 50 years of neoliberalism and business unionism, all they care about is their bottom line, and we have a deeply divided labor movement. And so the question in many ways for all of us is, how do you bring to the labor movement this understanding that we are going through a particular period of fundamental reorganization, that these three crises that I spoke about are all going to be resolved in one way or another over the next 30 years, over the next 15 or 20 years. And unless the labor movement, which has the possibility of being the only and the single most important unified movement, unless it understands its role, we are going to squander this and toss it away. Of course, labor will not understand its role unless there's an organized left that begins to function alongside labor, the labor movement in particular ways, etc. I understand that. And that's also part of the weakness we're experiencing, wherein the left in the world, the party formations have significantly fallen apart. The party formations across the world, the communist parties and the socialist party formations have gone through tremendous, many decades of deterioration. And the new social movement left that's emerged is unable to unify the left, the political left in a particular way. And under those conditions, the labor movement itself is fragmented, right? That is, let's say, a manifestation of the contradictions as it exists. The contradiction, as I explained, along the lines of the capitalist economy, a manifestation, a mirror of that as it exists within the world of social movements and the world of politics, right? How do we resolve that becomes the big question. I myself, for instance, right now, I'm going through a period of trying to, as part of what we've done in response to the Ubers and the Olas and the Lyfts and the Bolts of the world, is we've created a federation of grassroots organizations of drivers from across the world, 23 affiliate organizations out of 17 countries, most of them from the global south, in a formation called the International Alliance of App-Based Transport Workers. And in this formation, what we're trying to do is, intervene. For instance, the ILO is trying to set up new standards, a convention on platform work standards through a double discussion format in 2024 and 2025 and 2026. And we are, this international federation is seeking to engage that process, but finding it really difficult because some of the big, mainstream labor unions are sitting there as an interface with the ILO, and it's a process wherein you have to first negotiate with some of the mainstream labor unions who are not really, invested in this workforce, but they are sitting as gatekeepers in many ways, and therefore that negotiation has to be done, etc., etc. If we have to create the correct set of conventions, standards through a convention, right? And that's an ongoing struggle that I'm not hopeful about how well it will be resolved, but we are part of that process right now, right? So that's broadly, where things stand. I would say that the three spaces of the contradictions that I spoke about are the three spaces where we should think about how law interfaces in each of those. That is, in the world of finance capital, especially private equity capital. How do we take it on? How do we fight it? What are the ways in which legal institutions and the practice of law can intervene in that space to tilt the scales in favor of workers? in the climate change ecology space, especially how does one interface there? That is probably something that all of you probably know more about than I do. And then finally, in this world of what I call the immaterial material, wherein things like knowledge, data, spaces that were part of the commons in the world, and the colonization of that by capital, how do we intervene through intellectual property right law and new forms of regulation, new legislations, new frameworks, just like in the climate change space? You need new, absolutely forward-looking, visionary regulations, visionary practice of law, in the same way that we'll have to do that in this space to resolve that contradiction also. So I'll leave it there. I know I'm very aware that I haven't put out any big prescriptions, and I will not. But if in the Q&A session we have time, I can speak on individual cases, the kind of victories that the New York Taxi Workers Alliance has seen in a space like New York. Actually, I'll speak about it for 30 seconds or a minute before I close, because I realize I'm running out of time. In New York, for instance, what we've done is between 2017, 2018, and right now, the last 7 years, we've had tremendous victories against against the gig lords of Uber and Lyft, etc. Right, and we've done it by taking on each particular right of a worker. For instance, the right to, if you think about fundamental principles and rights at work, plus wages, if you think about that as a framework, then we've taken on the question of making sure that every driver in New York City who's part of our base earns minimum wage and more. How do you do that? When you don't have employee protections. We've taken that on as a problem, and we won that fight against Uber and Lyft. Similarly, the question of how do you ensure sick days? How do you ensure unemployment insurance? We're taking on every single right that the gold standard of employment gives us, and we're trying to ask the question, how do we win those? And there's a tremendous role that law plays in that, right? In terms of the fact that we've secured some of these, of course, through humongous levels, mobilization on the streets. For instance, when we launched our campaigns to do some of this in 2018, I think in the first 8 months of 2018, we had over 20 actions on the streets of New York City, blocking up bridges, taking over streets. In 2021, a 45-day sit-in outside City Hall, a 15-day hunger strike, through which the current mayor emerges as a political figure in a city like New York. Not the current mayor. The mayor is going to be Zoran Mamdani, who also goes on that 15-day hunger strike with the Taxi Workers Alliance outside City Hall, etc. Right? So tremendous struggle on the street, allied with brilliant legal minds and legal work that secures many different legal victories for us, and we fundamentally begin to reshape the regulatory framework of that industry in a city like New York, right? So we can see the application of law in the context of the forces of capital fueled by finance capital of the venture capital variety. How do we take them on? Very practical examples like that exist, right? So I want to be very clear that I'm not, when I haven't spoken in great detail, it's because every example of that sort lies at the local level, and we've got to think about how to suture, how to stitch these local efforts together to build a new understanding of what the role of law is, and especially how do you take the mainstream labor movement under conditions of a weakened left? How do you fix that problem and bring some of these practices to those spaces so that we can actually be globally effective? I would say right now we are tremendously effective in a space like New York City, but at a global level, we haven't yet managed to find ways of unifying in the labor movements around these principles of these contradictions and analysis of these contradictions, and taking them on and reaching new resolutions. We've got to prefigure a new kind of socialism, prefigure a new kind of global economy through the practices that we do right now as we take on these local struggles. That's the extent of my answer right now, but maybe as we engage in the Q&A period, we'll even come up with newer ideas. Thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Bijou, for masterfully tracing the three contradictions of capitalism and explaining how changes in the classification of transportation workers tracks these contradictions, and also for detailing the challenges the labor movement is facing, and the new international federation, which sounds very exciting, and your work in New York City with the intersection of legal work and mass movements. So thank you so much again for that. Our next faculty member, Bernard.
Allô. Bonsoir Marjorie, bonsoir tout le monde.
Hello Marjorie, hi everybody.
Okay.
I'm going to start to thank Marjorie
En remerciant Marjorie
that associated me to this academy.
À cette académie
I'm really honored to be part of this.
Je suis très honoré de me retrouver aux côtés
to be a teacher in this academy, and also honored to be a big responsible of the anti-capitalism movement. And I hope that my contribution is gonna let us improve our engagement even more against the capitalist system. So my presentation is going to talk about the system of new colonialism of the institution of Bretton Woods. Thank you, Erin.
Merci à Erin.
How you can see,
comme vous le voyez,
my presentation plan shows what the dues are and the Club of Paris.
Le mécanisme de la dette illégitime.
It's about death of the colonialism. Before starting, how you can see, I'd like to say that on the 26th of December 2004,
un séisme de magnitude 9,0 sous l'échelle de Richter a frappé
the Isle of Sumatra were hit, and we all remember this sonogram of what happened at that time, and we had like over 60,000 deaths in several countries. And after, in 2019, between 2019 and 2021, we had the COVID crisis, and this qualified as a pandemic, and it's hit many countries. We had many deaths in all over the world. And when I talk about these two topics, it's about I'm talking about this because they have things in common, and they both show the fragility of the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure in several countries, in health, education, habitation, and also regards of food and restoration. And everything fell apart during that these periods.
L'autre point commun à ces deux grands événements,
And
c'est que des voix se
many
sont
ask
élevées
for the annulation
pour
of
demander
debt,
l'annulation des dettes
public debts of the
extérieures
countries that were
publiques des
hit
pays qui sont
by
touchés
this
par
crisis to be
ces
able
événements
to
afin
respond
de leur
to
permettre
the challenges they had to
répondre
face. And the
aux
questions that I now asked myself:
Alors, la question que je me suis posée, c'est
what is the weight of
est-ce
those
que
debts,
le
the
poids de
budget
la
of these
dette
countries, that
dans le
before these
budget de
countries
ces
can
pays
respond to this
font que,
crisis,
avant
that
que
they
ces
really
pays ne
have to
répondent
ask for the
à
debts
cette
to be
crise, il faut
abolished.
demander l'annulation de cette dette-là.
So how do these
Comment est-ce que ces
debts
dettes
build up? Like,
sont constituées
why
pour que les
are
États
our
dépensent
countries
beaucoup de
paying so
l'argent
much for
pour
interest
payer les intérêts de la
instead
dette
of
et les priver
responding
de
to the
répondre
social
aux
needs
besoins
of their
sociaux de
populations?
leur communauté.
And when you do some research about
Et
that,
quand nous faisons les recherches sur
we
la dette, nous nous souvenons que
remember
le
that
29
in June
juillet
1957, the president of Burkina
alors
Faso,
président du Burkina Faso,
during a conference with the
lors de la conférence
heads
des
of
chefs
several
d'État
countries,
à Addis Abeba, en
citing
Éthiopie,
him,
disait ceci,
those that
je le
lend
cite,
us money are the
ceux
same
qui nous ont
that
prêté de l'argent,
colonized us. So
ce
these are
sont
the
les
same
mêmes qui nous ont
that
colonisés.
share
Ce sont
our
les
countries
mêmes
and
qui
economies.
gèrent nos États et nos économies.
That's why I'd like to say that in our
Alors, je
conference,
voudrais que notre conférence
we want to say that
dise
we
clairement
cannot pay
que nous ne
the
pouvons
debts,
plus
and
payer
if
la dette.
Burkina Faso is
Si le Burkina
refusing
Faso
to
seul
pay
refuse de payer la
debts,
dette,
I won't be there
je
at
ne
the next
serai plus
conference.
là
And he said
prochainement à la
that,
prochaine conférence.
and he refused to pay
Et
the
il a dit
debts.
ceci, en refusant de payer la
We,
dette,
in refusing to pay
nous
the debts,
pouvons
we
en être
help our
des
own development, and
Voici
that's
ce
what
que le
the
président
president said
Thomas Sankara
in
disait en
June
1996, en juillet.
1976. But
Les chefs d'État
however, they
africains
didn't
n'ont
accept
pas
this
accepté
proposition,
la
and
proposition
a
de
bit
Thomas
later he
Sankara.
was
Et
killed.
quelques mois
So
plus
the
tard,
question
il a
is
été
to know,
assassiné.
what are these debts?
Alors, la
Why
question est de savoir
have
c'est quoi la dette
pay
puisque
countries in
les
the
États
West?
occidentaux
Why do they do
puissent
everything
faire tout pour le maintenir dans les pays
that they, so that other
et que
countries,
ces
developing
pays
countries, cannot
puissent
refuse to
pas
pay
refuser
debts
les
and
dettes,
also
ou du moins refuser de payer
interest?
les intérêts de ces dettes-là
So
pour
to answer this
alimenter le
question,
développement de leur communauté.
I'd like to remind
Pour
you, so
répondre à
what
cette question,
are those
je voudrais juste faire un petit rappel.
debts?
C'est quoi la dette?
So
Quand on
there's
parle de la dette,
two kinds.
on
There's
a
like private debts,
il y a la dette
interior,
privée, qui est la
so
dette intérieure du
within a country, and also public debts.
pays,
So
et la dette publique, qui est la dette
so
extérieure du
we're
Alors,
talking
notre
about
présentation porte
the
sur la
external
dette
debts of
extérieure
developing
publique
countries.
des pays en
So we're
développement.
going to go to the next slide.
OK. Erin, on y va. Prochaine slide.
So those external debts of developing
dette
countries are also
extérieure
split
des
into
pays en
two
développement, elle aussi, est
types.
divisée
There are
en deux
public
parties.
external
Il y a la
debts and
dette
also
extérieure
private
publique
external
et
debts.
il y a la dette extérieure privée.
So let's go on.
Oui, on y va.
So we have external public debts, and these are debts.
La dette extérieure
These are
publique,
made by countries,
ce sont les dettes qui sont contractées
local
par
collectives,
les États,
or public
les
organism,
collectivités
or
locales,
private
ou les
organization
organismes publics,
where the
ou
debts
par
are
les organismes
guaranteed
privés dont
by
la
the
dette est
country.
garantie par l'État. Donc, ça voudrait dire que les dettes extérieures publiques, ce sont des
So these are
dettes entre
debts between countries and other
les États
or with international organisms. We're going to look what this means in the following. So these affects no enterprises.
Ça peut être des filiales
It could be
transnationales,
local,
ça peut être une banque locale, ça peut être une entreprise
local.
locale.
The private one is made by enterprises, so it's not affected by anything related to the countries. And the public is guaranteed by the state, And the private one is guaranteed by is private. So external public debts is the one that we're looking at. So that also has several levels. So we're going to look at the next slide. So the external public debt has several levels. So we have multilateral external debts. And we talk about these if the institution is like a multilateral line, like the World Bank, FMI, or other institutions. And these are those organizations that Bretton Woods talk about. So the FME and the World Bank. And if those lend money to other countries to let them develop. And the World Bank and FME are there to help the countries. So starting from this moment, we talk about multilateral debts, but the bilateral, if it's between countries. So, for example, if US lend money to Togo, so that's between two countries. So that's a bilateral. Then there's a private part of the third one, and that's if it's about a private bank or if it's not, for example, if you have like a private bank in the West that lends money to a country, then we talk about the commercial or private part. So here we see this level, there are several implications, and you need to know everything about this so that we know what is played here. So the question is to know, so when like heads of the countries are discussing about debts, you need to know like which mechanism is there, because it depends on those different types of debts. So for example, if it's multilateral, the interest is not the same as the same if it's, for example, a bilateral debt or if it's a private one. So these are the institutions of Bretton Woods. So these institutions that we call these institutions of Bretton Woods are the voluntary fund. So here you have the World Bank. And you see that those that are supporting the world economy are the basic workers. It's like the population that are at the bottom, and those are supporting the rich. And those rich ones are split into two categories. Ones are the leaders, and those that are in the Western countries. And both of these make like big deposits, and those the ones that are the populations, the one that pay everything at the bottom, that pay everything, like all the deposits and the interest, and they don't have any resources. They don't have any health care, no infrastructure. They don't have any advantages, but those are the ones that work and pay everything for the rich, and these institutions also. And the World Bank and the FME are those institutions within their communication, and those are part of the exploitation that we know nowadays.
Slide suivant.
So we're going to talk about the International Monetary Fund. It was created in 1945 after the Second World War, and the goal of it was to ensure the stability of the new monetary international system and to respect the stability of the system. And as so this affects United States, as you all know, like Bretton Woods. But starting in the 1970s, the mission changes.
La mission du FMI change un peu.
So now the mission is to support the countries that have financial difficulties, so that to avoid any financial crisis. And it's especially like about that in the 1980s, and those imposed the program of structural adjustment. And this program normally contributed to make countries weaker and to stop the development. Because it inflicted countries to pay a big amount of their money to be part of this program. So the countries so in this case, need to fund their resources on multinational, international, and these are fixed by the buyers, and they need to invest, those countries, and they're not allowed to invest in family ventures, infrastructures, but they need to invest into export, and the countries need to open their markets to other countries, so that that northern countries can enter like their products into the south, and it changes the whole program on infrastructure. That's in against the main goal that was to stabilize the monetary system. And the idea was to support the countries that had financial difficulties. But here there's a contradiction, because if you see the truth, like the International Monetary Fund doesn't work for the countries, like to help them, but to enforce the power and to dominate the weaker ones. So the second institution that Bretton Woods talks about is like the World Bank, and there's a lot of big confusion here because there's like the World Bank that was for the reconstruction and development was created in July 1944. And it was the initiative of 45 countries that united during the first monetary conference. And there was also the second, the Society of International Society of Finance that was created in 1956. And there's also the Association of International Association of Development that was created in 1906 to lend money to the weaker countries. And those were the ones that were in charge of lending money to third world countries. The next slide, please. So the third element of the World Bank so if we go to the next slide, please. is this international center of regulations of difference of investments that was created in 1966, and that was kind of a tribunal or an enterprise, a private one, to attack a country if a decision was made. So, for example, a country that was in development doesn't pay anymore any debts to a northern bank. So it's right. Then the bank can attack and go after this country. And this center is part of the World Bank and is part of the private financial sector. And the fourth element of the World Bank is the multilateral agency of investment guarantee that was created in 1988 to advance like investments. And so we have the expression World Bank, we have like those institutions, BIRD and AID, and I'd like to clarify this so that we see the mechanism that is installed to be able to dominate that, because it's about private investment. So because it's different if it's in between countries or if there's a private sector involved. This is dealt like within a different way, and but the forces that are on a international level are those that control the decision. So if we go ahead, so apart the FME and the World Bank, I'd like to focus about the Club of Paris. This club is an informal group. It's an informal organization. It doesn't have there's no paper or any declaration. It's an informal group of public interest. And the role is to find solution if there's difficulty for a country to pay any debt. So if there's this club has a meeting, a monthly meeting in Paris, and their ministry office, and they think about how to handle countries that cannot pay any debt anymore, because they would like to find a solution. They like to find a way. So, for example, this country has a president website, and all those challenges are imposed to the countries themselves. And these are communicated, the reports are communicated, are never published, but the decisions that are made within this plan are imposed to the countries that have debts, so the affected countries. And this is how the international powers can work. So, and if the CMP if there's a problem, like they cannot pay anymore, they cannot pay any debts, then this is imposed, any consequences paid by the Club of Paris. And if the country refuses, then all the country partners and of this club can take action against this country. So, for example, when in 2022, there was a case of the country of Togo in front of this club, and they took instructions, and they had to pay this debt. Although this country, this club doesn't have any juristic presence. So we're going to see the mechanism of the debt, the illegitimate debt. So we're going to explain what does that mean. So the external public debt, does that mean? And also the institutions of Bretton Woods that are the tools and the arms to control the countries that are affected. But the debt that we're talking about so it's qualified as hideous, illegitimate, and those and this is why then in that sense those countries are labeled as hideous debts, and those debts are not taken to support the countries that are in debt. They are not there to support the regimes with dictators. We have dictators where you have lots of corruption that dominates, or impunity, or we have regimes that where the debts are utilized to buy weapons or to kill and to torture the populations. And so it's these populations are paying those debts that are misused, and in that case, those debts are called illegitimate debts because they don't support the population in any way. So illegitimate debts are where the interests are paid by population, and this creates a lot of misery and frustration and misgovernance. What we nowadays know in countries, for example, in Africa, so that are badly developed. And although those countries have big debts, billions that need to be paid, they will never develop because that's money that is taken from the global World Bank or the FME is not used for the good of the population and for the well-being. And then this is the case when we're talking about illegitimate debt. So if we move to the next slide. So to be able to see illegitimate debt, we look reports of force. So the countries are, if the countries are weaker respective to other stronger countries. So if the amount is imposed, although it's a huge amount, the countries need to pay this huge amount, and there's a big force. And debts there's no consultation, so the countries don't ask the advice of the population before paying this, and in that case it's an unauthorized or illegitimate debt. So, and also if, like I already said, the goal of this debt doesn't support the population, if we talk about a precise case, if I ask for debts from country, for example, to build or to, for example, to build a harbor of Togo, but in the case of Togo, like a European country is exploiting this, and then it's also about not paying the interest or the debt itself that was used to build this part of the harbor, and this is a hideous debt and illegitimate debt. And this is what the president said, that he's not going to pay this debt. And after we have some numbers of the FME and FME, within 1 year, the the amount of that was 860 billion of euros. So you see the amount, so $1,860 billion. And that's only external debts. So it's not even with the internal ones. So that's the capital and the interest that are paid by the countries are like 90 billion only for the service of the debt. And that's the double of all received foreign help. And this is all from the Western forces that are sent to the affected countries, and it's half of the interest and of the debts that are paid by the countries themselves from the Western countries. So this means that we send the double of the half of the public help that we receive back. So basically, we are the ones that are supporting the Western countries, although those say that they're the ones sending us public funds to support us. And nowadays, after according to FME, 22 countries in Africa have over that, so they passed the amount of debt that they could ever have. And the problem is that in order to be able to pay, is that they have to pay the interest, they need to take in more debts. So additionally to the debts that are already there, and this is like vicious circle. So we're going to continue. So before I already mentioned, in the 90s, that is talking about the structural adjustment programs that only made countries more weaker, and also about the crisis that we had in 2022. And we have some numbers show us that after a COVID crisis, 60% of African countries had to spend more to reimburse the debts, much more than what they spent for health and the needs that they had. So, and this shows that that after the crisis in COVID-19, it distracted and the infrastructure, and they had to pay more than the interest of the debt to be reinvested to the health system. And this support should be for the support of the countries. And here you see that this is wrong. This is the opposite. So those institutions are there to hold the power, because if a country doesn't have a health care system or an educational system, or if a country cannot feed its population, how can this country develop? So how could this country develop if the budget of the country is paid to pay all the service that comes with the debts? And this is what is happening. What is happening if you compare the countries in the south with the country of the north? So if you look at all of this, we say that debts nowadays are like a tool of to dominate, that are utilized by Western countries to be in power, because with power, those countries can control the politics of the southern countries, and also affect the internal politics and also external politics. So with this, that they can have also the power to choose within the leaders of the countries, and they can impose a leader, and this mechanism lets them control a country politically. So that is a tool of economic domination, because the more you you don't pay any debts, the more debts you create. And this adds to the debt that's already existent. So, and they are oftentimes conditioned. If you imagine, if you lend, you get a credit from a country and then you add more to it. For example, if you get it from France, and then half of that is received by France goes back to France and is invested in French companies or enterprises. So this supports France. So basically, for all the money that's received by France, only 10% is really utilized in the country itself, and the rest is all returned to the country. So, and at the end, it's not the population that benefits it from anything, because I think instead of being spent for the population, it was utilized to pay for the debt and to pay for all the interest. So debts are an instrument, a tool of imposition, because the institution of Bretton Woods imposed the program of adjustment, and also imposed the initiative to pay. And the privatization of the banks and of companies, and everything to be was imposed by those institutions of Bretton Woods that supports the interests of the powerful. And this is why Thomas Carr said that we need to refuse to pay those debts, because it's an instrument of new colonialism, of an instrument, a tool of domination that is utilized by international organizations. So next slide. So to conclude, with those elements, would create a mechanism of that and have an impact of devastators. I'm going to share some suggestions and recommendations. So Africa, la piège de la dette, so the trap of debt. So it's a committee that is fighting for this topic, and also you need to oppose against these impositions, and to ask for the annulation of debts. Also is required to for an audit of the debts to be requested, to make it transparent of those debts, and how the money was utilized, and how the debts were created. So how was the money utilized, and also to know if the countries really need to pay the interest. And also it is necessary to put in place a veritable politics of reparations. So it needs to be like there needs to be reparations to be made. Because since the colonialism and the independence, those countries cultivated impunity and corruption, and they supported the countries and held them into a situation of underdevelopment, and so there are reparations that need to be made, and also for an audit needs to be requested from the FME and the World Bank, because the system of Bretton Woods, each time, if there's a mission of audit, the problem is that those institutions are never controlled by themselves. So they're never controlled in terms of the management of the funds and of the infrastructure. And so the FME and the World Bank need to be audited. The Club of Paris and all other organizations need to be audited themselves. Those who hold the system of that, to avoid those hideous debts in the future. So these are some elements that I'd like to share with you about the topic of hideous debt, and I'm really happy to be able to be part. And I'm really looking forward to our exchange and to your contributions and to your questions, if you have any, to continue with the conversation. Thank you very much, Marjorie.
Je vous remercie, Marjorie.
Merci beaucoup, Bernard, for analyzing the role of the Bretton Woods institutions, structural adjustment programs, and how they actually harm the states that they're ostensibly designed to protect. And also for explaining the concept of odious debt or illegitimate debt, how that actually harms the population in various countries, and the vicious circle of the way that countries in the global south are actually supporting the Western countries, and how the Western countries use debt as a tool of economic domination. Thank you so much for that. And our final faculty member is Walden Bello. We have a recording of Walden's presentation, so here we go. We don't have any sound, Aaron.
Sorry, one moment.
Good morning or good evening, depending on your time zone. I'm Walden Bello, and I'm joining you from Bangkok at this point. The title of my presentation is Deglobalization Towards the Right or the Left. In the 1990s, we were told that we were entering an era known as globalization, that owing to free trade and unobstructed capital flows in a borderless global economy would lead to the best of all possible worlds. Most of the West's political, economic, and intellectual elites bought into this vision. I still remember how the venerable Thomas Friedman of the New York Times lampooned those of us who resisted this vision as quote-unquote flat earthers or believers in a flat earth. I still recall the equally venerable Economist magazine singling me out as coining the word deglobalization, not with the aim of hailing me as a prophet, but as a fool preaching a return to a Jurassic Park. 30 years on, this flat earther takes no pride in having discerned the contours of the mess we are in, to which unfettered globalization has been a central contributor. The highest rates of inequality in decades, growing poverty in both the global north and the global south, deindustrialization in the United States and many other countries, massive indebtedness of consumers in the global north and whole countries in the global south, financial crisis after financial crisis, the rise of the far right, and intensifying geopolitical conflict. Globalization did not lead to a new world order, but to the brave new world. Let me present 3 snapshots of that era of globalization that we are now living. Snapshot number 1. Apple was one of the main beneficiaries of globalization. Apple led the escape away from the confines of the national economy to create global supply chains propped up by cheap labor. Let me just quote the New York Times in this regard. Quote, Apple employs 43,000 people in the United States and 20,000 overseas, a small fraction of the over 400,000 American workers at General Motors in the 1950s, or the hundreds of thousands at General Electric in the 1980s. Many more people work for Apple's contractors. An additional 700,000 people engineer, build, and assemble iPads, iPhones, and other Apple products. But almost none of them work in the United States. Instead, they work for foreign companies in Asia, Europe, and elsewhere at factories that almost all electronics designers rely on to build their wares, unquote. Apple, of course, was not alone in the drive to deindustrialize America. It was accompanied by fellow IT corporations, Microsoft, Intel, and NVIDIA, automakers GM, Ford, and Tesla, pharmaceutical giants Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer, and other leaders in other industries and services such as Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, Walmart, and Amazon, just to name a few. The favorite destination was China, where wages were 3 to 5% of wages of workers in the United States. The so-called China shock is estimated conservatively to have led to the loss of 2.4 million US jobs. Employment in manufacturing dropped to 11.7 million in October 2009, a loss of 5.5 million, or 32% of all manufacturing jobs since October 2000. The last time fewer than 12 million people worked in the manufacturing sector was before the Second World War in 1941. Snapshot number 2. The removal of the barriers to the free flow of capital globally led to the third world debt crisis in the early 1990s, which almost brought down Citibank and other US financial institutions, and to the Asian financial crisis in 1997, which brought down the so-called Asian miracle economies. Removing global capital controls was accompanied by the deregulation of the US financial system, which led to the creation of massive profit-making scams through the so-called magic of financial engineering, like the frenzied trading in subprime mortgages. Not only were millions bankrupted and lost their homes when the subprime securities were exposed as rotten, but the whole global system stood on the brink of collapse in 2008, and it was saved only by the bailout of US banks, with US taxpayers' money to the tune of over $1 trillion. Snapshot number 3 is a famous French economist Thomas Piketty's summing up of the United States economic tragedy of the first quarter of the 21st century. I quote, "I want to stress that the word collapse is no exaggeration. The bottom 50% of the income distribution claimed around 20% of national income from 1950 to 1980. But that share has been divided almost in half, falling to just 12% in 2010 to 2015. The top centile share has moved in the opposite direction, from barely 11% to more than 20%, unquote. Accompanying this massive increase in inequality in the United States has been an increase in poverty. Globally, according to available data, since the financial crisis of 2007-2008, wealth inequality has risen, so that now the top 1% owns half the world's total household wealth. Let me turn from this nostalgic recounting of the past, and once more allow me to focus on our good friend Apple. It is now leading the so-called reshoring process. It has read the handwriting on the wall, and though this will negatively affect its bottom line and scramble its operations, to protect the remainder of its super profits, it is leading the relocation of its supply chains with a planned $600 billion investment in manufacture within the United States of its iPhone, iPad, MacBook, as well as in the fabrication of semiconductor chips. Boasting that Apple's manufacturing plants will create 450,000 jobs in the United States, Chief Executive Officer Tim Cook admitted to being a hostage to Trump's push to deglobalize the operations of American firms, saying, and I quote, "The president has said he wants more in the United States, so we want more in the United States," unquote. Where Apple goes, others follow. Among them, US chip makers Intel and NVIDIA, automotive leader Tesla, and pharmaceutical giant Johnson & Johnson. But American firms are not the only hostages to politics. Among the foreign firms that have bowed to Trump's ultra-protectionist push via unilateral tariff increases, by regionalizing or nationalizing their supply lines are Hyundai Motors, Honda Motors, Samsung Electronics, Taiwanese chip maker TSMC, and pharmaceutical firm Sanofi. While reshoring or relocation has proceeded by fits and starts over the last decade, Under the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, it is likely to accelerate over the next few years, despite constraints and inefficiencies, as economic nationalism rises in the United States and the West. In 2023, an exhaustive study of North American firms showed that more than 90% of manufacturing companies in the region had moved at least some of their production or supply chain in the past 5 years. Another study conducted at the same time showed that by 2026, 65% of surveyed companies would be buying most key items from regional suppliers, compared to just 38% in 2023. With Trump imposing unilateral tariffs on Mexico and Canada, companies are realizing that relocating to the NAFTA partners may not appease Trump. They will have to relocate to the United States itself, despite the disruption and chaos that might accompany that process, such as that which saw 300 workers vital to the Hyundai facility in Georgia arrested by ICE agents and deported to Korea in August of this year. The tremendous global anger and resentment at the dystopia to which corporate-driven globalization has led us is perhaps the biggest reason why deglobalization will be the trend for a long, long while. That rage first came from the left, which inflicted a reversal from which corporate-driven globalization never recovered during the historic Battle of Seattle in December 1999. But it was Donald Trump and other forces of the far right that successfully rode that anger to political triumph in the United States and Europe in the coming decades. In other words, the politics of rage, not the economics of narrow efficiency in the service of corporate profitability, is now in command. In the United States, globalization created two antagonistic communities, one that benefited from it due to their superior education and incomes, the other that suffered from it owing to their lack of both economic and educational advantages. The latter is the vast sector of the population that Hillary Clinton called, quote, deplorables, unquote, but is better known as the Make America Great Again, or MAGA folks, the MAGA base. That community will not easily forget either the sufferings brought about by the deindustrialization spearheaded by Apple and other well-known TNCs, or the slights they endured from Hillary, whom they regard as being in the pocket of Wall Street. A second reason for the strength of the deglobalization wave is that the multilateral order that serves as the political canopy or system of governance for free trade and unobstructed capital flows is on the brink of collapse. The World Trade Organization, which was once described as the jewel in the crown of multilateralism, no longer functions as a system for governing world trade, partly owing to sabotage by the United States. When under Obama and later under Trump and Biden, Washington could no longer rely on favorable rulings in trade disputes. The International Monetary Fund has not recovered from its reputation of promoting austerity in developing countries and its push for unfettered capital flows that brought down the Asian tiger economies. The World Bank also is discredited for its complicity in imposing austerity measures, as well as for the wrong-headed policy of export-oriented industrialization for global north markets that the bank prescribed as the route to austerity for developing countries, one that is now especially fatal for those who followed it, given the ultra-protectionism sweeping the United States. Third, national security, both economic security and military security, has displaced prosperity through trade and investment as the principal consideration in relations among countries. Both the Biden and Trump administrations have tried to stem the flow of advanced technology, such as cutting-edge NVIDIA chips to China, and more such measures will follow. Reorganizing and regionalizing, if not nationalizing, access to and supply lines for key resources like lithium, rare earth, copper, cobalt, and nickel is now an overriding concern. The aim being not only to monopolize these sensitive commodities, but to prevent competitors from getting hold of them. The issue is not the inevitability of deglobalization, but what form deglobalization will take. Deglobalization marked by ultra-protectionism in trade relations, unilateralism, and isolationism in economic and military relations, a ban on migrants from the global south, and the creation of a domestic market geared principally towards the interests of the racial and ethnic majority is one way to deglobalize. That is indeed where Trump is leading the United States. And this is expressed in very brazen terms in the recently released U.S. National Security Strategy 2025. But there is another way to deglobalize, the key elements of which I laid out in my book, Deglobalization, Ideas for a New World Economy 25 years ago. 1, we do not demand a withdrawal into autarky, but continued participation in the international economy, but in a way that ensures that instead of swamping it, international market forces are harnessed to assist in building the capacity to sustain a vibrant domestic economy. 2, we propose that via a judicious combination of equality-enhancing redistributive measures and reasonable tariffs and quotas, the internal market will again become the engine of a healthy economy instead of being an appendage of an export-oriented economy. 3rd, we promote participation in a plurality of economic groupings, those that allow countries to maintain policy space for development, instead of imprisoning them in a single body, the World Trade Organization, with a uniform set of rules, one that favors the interests of transnational corporations instead of the interests of their citizens. Fourth, inspired by the work of Karl Polanyi, we advocate the re-embedding of the market in the community so that instead of driving the latter, as in global capitalism, the market is subject to the values and rhythms of the community. In short, society must reassert its control over the market. Solidarity must have priority over profitability. And finally, in contrast to the far right, we uphold the notion of community as one where membership is not determined by blood or ethnicity, but by a shared belief in democratic values. That is the alternative we offered a quarter of a century ago. Now, this fluid system of international trade that allows especially the economies of the global south the space to pursue sustainable development is not far from the flexible global trading system before the takeoff of globalization in the late 80s. This was the general agreement on tariffs and trade. 25 years ago, we were promoting, and we continue to promote, a route of progressive deglobalization. One that avoids the extreme of the doctrinaire dystopia or corporate-driven globalization on the one hand, and on the other, the savage unilateralism and protectionism of Donald Trump. This route to globalization is not new, nor would some claim particularly radical. Keynes' common sense advice, and I refer here to John Maynard Keynes, the eminent, most prominent economist of the 20th century. Keynes' common sense advice addressing the global situation in the 1930s is very relevant to our times. And let me give you this quote from Keynes because it is something that we do need to have in mind all the time. I quote, "Let goods be homespun whenever it is reasonably and conveniently possible, and above all, let finance be primarily national," unquote. Had we taken this route, I dare say, the chances are great that we would not be in the terrible mess the world is in today, with the threat not only of trade war, but of real war at its doorsteps. Because geoeconomic rivalry oftentimes slides into geopolitical rivalry. Indeed, sometimes, warfare. There is still time to take this route. But the window of opportunity is closing fast. Well, that's my brief presentation. Again, let me just assert here that deglobalization is the way of the future. And the question is, what kind of deglobalization it will be? Will it be Trump's savage deglobalization. And this is the creation of techno-economic fortress America, where foreign goods are basically discriminated against via high tariffs. Capital is padlocked into the United States. Migrants from the global south are either expelled or refused entry. And we have a social policy governing that says that only those of the appropriate skin color or the same culture or the same ethnic community will enjoy the privileges provided by citizenship. That's Trump's way. Or do we pursue another route to deglobalization? One that uses international market forces not to destroy the local domestic market, the local economy, but they are harnessed to strengthen the local economy, where our economies of the global south are not pushed into just one route of development that is the sort of route that was pushed by neoliberalism on us via the World Trade Organization? Or do we move to a more pluralistic system whereby our countries and our economies are allowed or join the kind of economic groupings that will allow them to prosper? So these are the considerations that I would like to leave with you. And I would like, again, to thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your session today. Good luck to all of you. And let's hope for the best. These are very trying times that we are now embarked on. But I do believe that with goodwill and with hard thinking, we in fact can choose the right path that would lead to true prosperity and equality. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Walden for tracing the trends in deglobalization and for explaining Donald Trump's protectionism, his tariffs, and ban on migrants from the global south. And also thanks for proposing some potential routes for progressive deglobalization to harness and strengthen local economies and help people's lives instead of oppressing them. We will now move to the next part of our program, which is the discussion between the faculty members or comments on each other's presentations. And unfortunately, we don't have Walden with us in person. He's in transit. But if Bijou and Bernard would like to raise other issues, questions, comment on each other's presentations, this would be the time to do it. Either one or both of you.
Sure. Thanks, Margie. And I mean, I'm just opening up something for a broader discussion, but because Walden is not here, I'm just trying to think through Bernard's presentation, Walden's presentation, and mine, and trying to identify where we have all brought in the local. Walden, through the idea of deglobalization, which focuses on a particular kind of autonomy for the local. Bernard's frame is the national. And I myself have, in terms of the industry that I work out of, I've looked at so much in terms of the successes that we've had in New York, fighting against giants such as Uber. I just feel like the very scale of the local that the three presentations are talking about is itself very different. Because, and I'm going to make an argument. I want to say that how do we find a quote unquote local economy that is not already neoliberal, right? And what does an experiment in deglobalization mean when you have a national government in the global south that's committed to, already committed to globalization in a particular way? Or for that matter, what does it mean, I mean, so, I'm trying to imagine how the solution really looks, right? I mean, yeah, I'll stop there. I don't know. I'm not at all suggesting an answer, but I'm opening up a question more than anything else. What is the local? What is the scale of the local? Is it, and maybe I'm struggling with the fact that I'm in the United States. It's a humongous country, it's the size of a continent. And within that itself, we have such unevenness in terms of, where all particular kinds of fights are even possible, etc. So, and then you have a national government that's now headed towards a deglobalization from the right. So I'm kind of I'm struggling with what is the local, how do we think of the local in this context? I don't know whether Bernard has some answers to this, or even somebody in the audience has some answers to this.
So he said at the local level in the global south, we have the localities, the mayor, for example, and we are trying to get texts from that level to the state. As citizens, we have to act on the local level and we have to pressure the leaders to influence local development. And yes, there are several levels of actions from the local level until the national and international level. So yes, I agree with him. We are seeing eye to eye. If the reflection is local, yes, the actions have to be done in the local on the local level, so we can develop that from the local side until the national level and to the international level as well.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Going to the questions now from the. Okay. The first question, and I believe this is directed to Bijou, is please speak about carbon markets as a commodity and the contradictions surrounding it.
Yeah, I'm not, as I said, in this whole thing, I'm the part that I'm most unsure about in terms of my own capacities, is to be able to talk about the environmental / ecological part of the contradiction. And the comments on carbon markets, all of that, is that, the way we are trying to solve the ecological crisis, the crisis of climate change that we are in the middle of, is by going to net zero. And the crucial word there is net zero carbon emissions. That is, it's not as if you're going to stop emitting carbon, but it's going to be a net zero. That is, somebody continues to emit, some forces of capital will continue to emit carbon, whereas others will be decarbonizing, and they get credits for decarbonizing. And the way that those who continue to emit carbon will be allowed to do so is because they buy these credits that somebody else has gained through successful work of decarbonization, right? So that's it's the most twisted logic that you can think of, but it is the logic of it's a logic of dealing with the climate change crisis through the structure of a commodity, right? So that's where that's where I see some fundamental problems, in the sense that, yes, it's true, we can't get away from a carbon economy overnight by a wave of a magic wand. We certainly cannot. But if we are to go to a more sustainable solution that, let's say, is a solution that gets us closer to a socialist economy, then is it through this idea of carbon credits and carbon trading, the capacity to buy up carbon credits from an international market? Does that take us any closer to it? That's a question I'm posing. It's not a question to which I have any clear answers. So, I mean, I'll give you an example, right? So, for instance, right now, if you look at what happened in the last 1 year in this world of climate change related forces playing itself out, we have this very interesting experiment that's come out of India. I think it's called Mati Carbon, and it is the scientist who has figured out a way to take a certain dust coming out of a stone quarrying process, and you take the tailings, the dust, the broken pieces of rock that come out of a particular stone quarrying process, and if you mix it into the sand, into the soil where you're growing paddy or wheat, then not only does the yield become higher, but you also end up pulling out carbon from the air and locking it back into the soil. So this is a process of decarbonization. And this scientist who did this has won many awards and is now taking the technology across the world, especially into Africa and spaces like that, and is trying to take it directly to farmers, etc. And in that process, trying to set up an exchange where all these farmers who are implementing the decarbonized form of production are gaining carbon credits. And then all these people who are going to be fueling AI through data centers, which consume enormous amounts of energy, are going to be buying up carbon credits from these farmers, right? This is how it's visualized. And I just feel like there's something absolutely false in the solution, right? And there has to be an entirely different resolution to this, right? And I don't quite know what that is, and I'm posing it as a challenge that all of us have to think through, and so it could be that that you even have to think through how much of this AI we really need and for what reason, and therefore what is the scale of data centers we need construction. Is data centers and the use of AI itself something that needs to, do we need to set up a goal wherein that has to be a nationalized industry under government control, under democratic government control? Is that the direction which we must go? Because then you won't have the same scale of expansion, right? And therefore, then, it doesn't need, carbon credit sales, etc., to run those kinds of spaces, etc., right? So I don't, what I'm putting out here is merely an experiment in thinking. It's nowhere near a solution. It's nowhere near even pointing in the direction of a solution, because I'm not confident about it. But I'm just saying that there's something fundamentally wrong with this idea of carbon credits, trading, all of that as a solution to the global crisis of climate change and ecology.
Thank you, Bijou. I think you started to answer the next question, which is, can we suggest some proactive solutions? And you did talk about the climate change area, and of course, in terms of legal solutions or legal ways to deal with it, the International Court of Justice has recently come out with a landmark decision determining that those most responsible for climate change have a legal duty to stop doing what they're doing, which is harming people, especially in the global South and the South Pacific. But I'm just wondering now if you, Bijou, and Bernard, who I believe is back into the interpretation room, want to propose any other proactive solutions in addition to what Bijou has said about climate change.
I'll yield to Bernard and then I'll come back in.
Okay, Bernard, would you like to deal with that issue of proactive solutions to the mess that we are facing on a global scale? We seem to have lost Bernard. And also, Bijou, there's another question that is directed to you. How important is a leftist government in the resistance to commodification? You might want to address that as well.
Yeah, I absolutely will, no problem. But if Bernard is stepping in, then I'll yield to Bernard first.
OK. Merci beaucoup.
Okay.
Bijou,
thank you
Marjorie,
very much, Bijou. And Marjorie,
très bien connecté
I'm
dans la salle de
okay. I'm
l'interprétation.
very well connected in the French interpretation room.
C'est juste des fois l'interprétation
It's just that sometimes the interpretation
n'est pas vraiment clair pour que tu puisses comprendre la question
is not
et
really
réagir.
clear
Donc,
to be able to
je
understand
félicite les interprètes qui font un
interpretation.
excellent travail. Félicitations.
So congrats to the
Oui,
interpreters
et
that are doing a great
évidemment,
job.
sur
So
ce désordre que nous vivons au niveau mondial en ce qui concerne
this disorder that we are currently
aujourd'hui,
living on a global
je
level,
pense que c'est un
I
défi
think
pour les pays du Sud. Et
it's
les récents événements en Côte d'Ivoire,
really hard for the southern countries, like the recent episodes on the Ivory Coast with the
Pays-Bas en Hollande, qui a circulé dans des ports en Occident où ces déchets ont été refusés.
Of the northern countries that had effect on these recent actions
en contradiction totale des règles
are in total contradiction with those countries,
et la pollution de l'environnement, montre comment
because those are the victims of the pollution and especially for the southern countries that are really fragile, and those stronger countries that are the ones polluting the environment with CO2 have the responsibility to protect the citizens.
Contre ces fléaux, mais nos États sont impuissants face à ces éléments.
But those countries, they're like incapable in regards to those events.
Au Brésil qu'il faut le résoudre, mais c'est
And,
en appliquant les
that's
principes directeurs de l'OCDE. Et c'est
it's also to there's a need to apply the regulation of CO2 so that the big enterprises that cause this pollution can be held responsible to do the reparations and to take actions of the consequences of these actions. And but those northern countries control the southern countries, and the right of environment is not respected nowadays, and that's a big problem in general. And so I think that we should better organize the movements. And this is in regards to Togo, we have like international and regional platforms that are like organized by alternative media and groups who have this platform to protect the environment and to really make those enterprises responsible that are the one causing this pollution. And it's important that this topic is discussed on an international level. And what I can say is that
I'm gonna say that, I'm gonna take, I think there were a couple of questions there, and I want to say that we have to, within the framework of bourgeois democracy, produce struggles that will give us relatively different governments, right? And there's nothing called within the structure of bourgeois democracy, there is nothing called a revolutionary left government that can come into place overnight. If we are going to struggle with the bourgeois democratic frame, we're going to deal with the electoral process there, then what we will get is imperfect left governments. We have to just accept that, right? If we this is where part of what happens with what I call the ultra left, wherein you read a certain theory in a book about what a particular left revolutionary imaginary is, and then within bourgeois democracy, when there are struggles, you get critical of them. And I just want to say that that's a disjuncture that we have to just contend with, rather than necessarily, assume that somehow there is a solution available, right? Okay, so having said that, because without some control over the state, there are no solutions. So assuming that we will all participate in struggles that will produce imperfect left governments in different scales of local spaces, whether it is, let's say, in a city like New York, we are headed into a Mamdani administration, or whether it's in a country like, let's say, Colombia, where you have a coalition left government, right, etc. You can have various forms of this, right? The question then is, once you have control over a government, over the state space in a particular way for a limited period of time, what do you do? And I think that's where what I call experiments in prefiguring socialism come into place through legislation, through litigation, through people's struggles, through all of this combined, through media battles, right? Wherein you try to make a new imaginary take hold, right? And there are some wonderful experiments that are already out there, and that's what I think we need to hold on to. When I mentioned that multi-carbon experiment, right? It's a wonderful experiment of saying what happens if farmers gain control, right? And especially if there are small farming sector, it's part of a deglobalization agenda of taking agriculture away from big business, etc. Right? Similarly, here's a thought experiment, and it's merely a thought experiment at this stage, and we've got to ask the question: some version of this thought experiment, how do we build a mass movement around it? How do we build structures of litigation and legislation around it? I think that's the challenge. So it's not a prepackaged complete solution that I'm putting in front, but a mere experiment, and in thinking, and then opening up that space for us to struggle together to produce something that may not look like anything that I'm proposing when we end up where we end up, right? So in a city like New York, there are about 1 million for-hire vehicle rides in a day. That is 1 million passengers, right? Either 1 or 2 passengers at a time or 3 passengers at a time, whatever. 1 million fares get dropped from point A to point B. The average cost of this at today's market prices is, let's say, about $18, $20, something like that. Let's even, just for the purposes of simplicity, make it $15. If you take that principle that I laid out earlier, that anything that was being done by a human being, if it gets automated, then we have to understand that the value that that human being was contributing, either through the extraction and execution of publicly available knowledge in work, or through the data of that person's work that is captured, and therefore a certain amount of knowledge that that person learned somewhere else being implicitly available in the data. If that intellectual property, so to speak, gets absorbed, that value gets absorbed into the automation, and the deployed automation then produces value on the streets of New York, an autonomous car. That is, let's say tomorrow, every single for-hire vehicle in New York City is replaced by an autonomous car, and there are, each of those rides is worth $15. Then the question is, what part of each of those $15 belongs to that data, that implicit knowledge, that the automated system holds that inside it? And what kind of legislation is required to secure that value, right? So I would say, for instance, using some simple arithmetic, what part of that value that is produced out of every $15 ride does the worker appropriate, either to sustain themselves or to pay for expenses, etc.? Let's say it's 2/3 of every $15. That is $10, right? So $10 out of every ride, a million rides a day. That's $3 million per. I'm sorry, 1 million rides a day. $10 out of every ride. That's $10 million a day for 365 days. You do all that calculation, and you're somewhere between $3 to $4 billion worth of value that would be produced by this autonomous car industry system. That is essentially the value that we'll have to extract back out of that system and toss it back into the public space. Let's say it goes into a common pool as part of the city budget that will pay for healthcare, so that healthcare can be completely socialized, right? The New York City budget right now is about $100 million. $100 billion, a little over $100 billion. So if this one industry can produce $4 billion that can go into a pool to produce one service in a socialized fashion, then I think we have prefigured something. Is it possible? I mean, that's the struggle, right? We have to have a complex of people's struggles. We have to have political figures who will create that imaginary for the public to hang on to. I teach, so one of the questions I would ask in many of my classes is, will you vote for a presidential candidate in the United States who's going to give you a 3-day work week without any reduction in wages? Because at productivity levels, I think we are ready for a 3-day work week, right? It's just that all that value that would otherwise allow all of us to just work 3 days and produce enough to feed and clothe and do everything that's necessary for making life pleasurable in this world, right? So, that can be done in 3 days. It's just that all that value is being appropriated by the capitalist class, right? So, just as in the early 1900s, all across the world, in a wave of labor struggles, we are able to enact an 8-hour workday, a 5-day work week. We should be able to enact a 3-day work week and decide how we're going to take all the value that the productivity jump that all this is producing is going to be spent, or going to be deployed, right? I think that's the challenge. It's a tremendous challenge, it's a huge challenge, not something small. But I mean, that's what we have to struggle for and with from within the frame of bourgeois democratic politics for now, hoping to transform the system over the next 20, 30 years as we resolve some of these contradictions.
So thank you so much, Bijou. We're going to leave it at that. Thank you to Bijou, Bernard, and Walden, our administrator, the interpreters, as well as the People's Academy Task Force. The next program of the People's Academy of International Law will be Course 12, U.S. Economic Aggression and U.S. Military Aggression Against Venezuela. It is scheduled for Tuesday, January 20th, and you will receive more information soon. So thank you all for coming and for your attention and your commitment, and we will see you in January. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Merci beaucoup, Marjorie. Merci pour les
Thank you,
interprètes.
everybody. Thanks
merci
to
à tous les
interpreters.
participants.
Thanks to
Heureux
all
d'avoir participé
participants.
à ce cours.
And I hope
Et j'espère,
to be able to be joining
revenir,
again in the near
prochainement
future.
pour ce
Thank you
cours.
very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Yes, thank you so much to the interpreters. Thank you. Thanks, Marjorie. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Erin.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.